Hello, friends. I'm going to go really fast because, as Liz said, we have a deeper version of this in a little bit. Rebuild Local News' premise started in 2020 as an informal coalition of different groups, about 35 different national and state groups promoting public policies to strengthen local news. We spun off as a separate nonprofit organization earlier this year. And the idea is that in addition to the better business models and editorial models that everyone is working on and are essential, increased philanthropy, thank you, large, medium, and small. The third pillar has to be public policy. Philanthropy alone is not going to be enough. Our goal is to try to generate $1 billion a year in public support by year 10. It's going to take a while to get there, but we think that is both what is needed, the amount that is needed, and also is achievable. And the goal of these public policies is not just to prop up existing players, but to be future-friendly, to actually help, hopefully, encourage and strengthen the efforts to reimagine journalism and better cover communities. So very quickly, through the landscape of federal and state activity, July 19th, a new bill was introduced called the Community News and Small Business Support Act. You're going to hear a lot of fun Washington bill titles. We call it Tenney Del Bene because it's sponsored by Claudia Tenney, a very conservative Republican from upstate New York, and Suzanne Del Bene. And that was our main criteria, is that the names of the sponsors rhyme, so we wouldn't have to call it the other thing. So the small business part is really interesting. It is a tax credit for small businesses that advertise in local news. So the tax credit actually goes to restaurants and car dealers and grocery stores, small businesses. And in fact, just yesterday, we got great news, which is that it is being endorsed by the National Restaurant Association, which I believe is the first time that a business group has endorsed an effort to strengthen local news. The second piece of it is a refundable payroll tax credit for news organizations that hire or retain local reporters. This provision passed the House of Representatives last session, came within 2 votes of passing in the Senate. It would be a big deal, $25,000 per reporter in the first year and $15,000 in the subsequent years. So that equals $1.7 billion over 5 years, including $120 million for BIPOC media and $120 million for nonprofit media. This bill has 22 co-sponsors, 11 Republicans and 11 Democrats. And no, we don't have huge optimism about it passing in the next few months, but it's an important foundation to be laid for the future and for stimulating activity on the state level, which I will get to in a sec. There's some other things happening on the federal level very rapidly. The Journalism Competition and Preservation Act. This is the one that is sometimes referred to as the Australia model. This is the force Google and Facebook to compensate local news organizations. In full disclosure, our coalition is neutral on this because our members are divided on it, but I wanted to mention it because it is one of the bills that is out there. I don't think that's going to pass either this year, but it's being pushed very strongly by the News Media Alliance, which is the trade association that represents national magazines and newspaper chains. Antitrust. Public policy isn't just about subsidies. We are in a situation, as you know, where half the newspaper circulation in America right now is owned by hedge funds. If we don't deal with that, a lot of these other ideas are not going to be particularly effective. We, along with the News Guild, the union, submitted a proposal and comments to the Federal Trade Commission and the Justice Department saying that acquisition of newspapers by hedge funds should be scrutinized by antitrust regulators if there's evidence that is going to undermine the community. And a similar argument was made by the union at the Federal Communications Commission, and it led to the blocking or stalling of a hedge fund taking over a bunch of TV stations. So that was a big milestone. But because of the sort of dysfunction in Washington, what's happened in the last year is that a lot of these ideas are now popping up in the states. And it's very exciting, and there's really a kind of a very broad range of ideas for what might work. It's a real period of experimentation. So the tax credits for small businesses that I mentioned as part of the federal bill was in a bill in Wisconsin and Colorado and Maryland, and we think it's going to be introduced in Kansas and West Virginia. Rebuild Local is going to unveil a model bill version of that in a couple of months. The payroll tax credit is being pushed in the New York legislature. The idea of government as advertiser, so the government itself is an advertiser, and New York City really pioneered, and CUNY, the Center for Community Media, pioneered an approach where they got the city to put half of the advertising money into community news organizations. And it was really very impactful. So we're now working with CUNY to try to replicate that in other states. We just put out a model bill on that. A bill doing that passed the Connecticut Assembly. They put a little interesting twist, which is they said 50% of the advertising money needed to go to locally owned news organizations in Connecticut. These are the laboratories of democracy, doing all sorts of experiments. San Francisco, I think, is going to do something. Fourth is fellowships, sort of Report for America-style fellowships. New Mexico, Washington State, and the biggest one, California. And these are basically, you know, not just one-month things. These are 1, 2, 3-year fellowships in local newsrooms. The one in California, they got $25 million. It's being administered by the Berkeley J School. The one in Washington's being administered by the Washington State University. And we're getting a lot of questions about that as a model. Straight grants targeted toward news deserts and other needs. The best example of that is in New Jersey, the New Jersey Information Consortium. Number 6 is probably, the last two I'll mention are kind of the least developed, like there's fewer hard pieces of legislation making it through, but there's a lot of discussion about them. There had been a concept of, well, maybe we should also subsidize consumers to help them buy subscriptions or make donations to local newsrooms. And it's a great concept, but there's always problems with different ways of implementing it. And honestly, we haven't totally figured this out, but there's an experiment. That concept is probably going to be in federal legislation. And there's an experiment in the early stages in Seattle around a news voucher idea that might be another approach to it. And then California has a mix of all of these. The California, there's a state version of the JCPA, that's the Force Google and Facebook to Compensate News Organizations bill that passed the Assembly. And then there's another bill, but a bunch of people were saying, well, we're not so sure that this is actually going to help small and medium media. Our view was that that probably was the case. And so we put out a compromise proposal that would have a guaranteed minimum for small and medium-sized publishers in California. The last category I would say is a general category that we call replanting. And it is the idea that there also needs to be strong public policy around either newspapers that are currently held by hedge funds or private equity or big chains, getting them replanted into local ownership, or making it possible so that news organizations that exist and don't want to sell to a big chain would rather sell to or donate to a community will have that opportunity. That can be done through financial incentives. We think that there should be a federal notice law where any newspaper that is being sold or is going to be about to be sold to a chain outside of the state would have to wait for 120 days. So to at least give possibility for the community to organize to acquire the newspaper. That's like a whole new area that is still being developed under the general rubric of replanting. So that's the quick tour of all that's going on in the states and the federal government, and we will be going into more depth a little bit later. And thank you.